All right, welcome to the hopefully last part of the lecture for this week. Today, this part, we're going to be talking about deontological ethics, and in particular, Kant. I'm going to focus on Immanuel Kant. So, again, this lecture is brought to you by Joey, the dog. This may end up being a slightly longer lecture. If it ends up being that way, I don't blame you if you get lost and bored at any given point, but I'll try to make it interesting at the very least. All right, so this is, an image of Immanuel Kant. At least he tried. And we're studying today deontology, which is a duty-based approach to ethics. Deon has to do with duty in Latin. All right, so the basics of a deontological approach to ethics. Deontology says that there's a difference between the right and the good. That is, consequentialism and utilitarianism focus on the good. They think that you ought to do things and maximize goodness with respect to the consequences of your actions. Deontology says, okay, the good is all good, but really what matters for morality is the right. What's right and what's wrong acting rightly is good, but you have to act rightly for it to morally matter. Like, goodness and badness, they matter in a sense, but really if goodness and badness gets brought about in the wrong sort of way, then morally speaking, we haven't, we might have screwed up. Morally speaking, deontology thinks that the right and the wrong are more central to morality. So deontology thinks, that the right is fundamental and the good is subject to the right. That is, some actions that may lead to good consequences are not morally good because they are not morally right actions. So what is the right? Like, what is it for something to be right, morally wrong? It could be all sorts of things. On the deontological point of view, at least initially, though, the one thing that we can be sure of is that it isn't determined by the good. So in a consequentialist approach, the goodness or badness of an action is determined on the basis of whether or not the consequences are good or bad, and that tells you whether or not the action was morally right or morally wrong. On a deontological approach, you do the reverse of that. You determine whether or not the action is morally right or morally wrong, and then you can determine whether or not it is morally good or morally bad on the basis of that. And this, in the end, sometimes morally right action can lead to what generally would be thought of as bad consequences, but they're not going to be morally bad consequences. Here's an example. Divine command theory. Divine command theory thinks that what's right is determined by God's will. Then the idea would be, so if you do what's right, you're doing what God has commanded, and then what is good is determined by what is right, right? So you act rightly because you honor your father and mother. That's in line with God's will, and then the actions of honoring your father and mother are good because they are right, rather than right because they are good. The natural rights theory. So a natural rights theory says that human beings and maybe other living creatures have natural rights, possibly given by gods. And the idea here then is that the rights that these human beings have determine the duties that other beings have, right? So if I have a right to not being injured by anyone else, like, not having my bodily autonomy or not being, not having my freedom infringed upon, then that means that you have a duty not to infringe upon my freedom, right? And so the idea is another sort of version of a basic deontological view is that somehow we have rights. They're given to us by God, or they just naturally happen to exist. And that determines the duties that we have, and then the duties are the sort of, if we follow our duties, then morality kind of follows with that. Here's another example, right? So parents, naturally, it seems, have duties to their children. There are special obligations that parents have to their own children that aren't had by others, right? So if I have a child, my neighbor is not duty bound to feed that child, right? To take care of that child. I am, my neighbor isn't. Well, why is that? I mean, like, it's definitely not like an issue of proximity. My neighbor might be closer to my child than I am most of the time. You know, if I'm off at work and my neighbor works from home, then, you know, it's definitely not an issue like that. And, you know, it might be great if the neighbor takes care of the child when the child is in need, but clearly the neighbor is not duty bound to the child, doesn't have a special obligation to the child, because the child is not theirs. Special obligations are usually what we might think of as particular. A particular obligation is an obligation that is to a particular person, but they don't necessarily have to be. So here's like some other examples. So students have a general obligation to treat professors with respect, right? It's an obligation that all students have. And on the basis of this general obligation, we can derive a specific obligation that you students have towards me, that you students ought to treat me with respect. I, however, on the other hand, have taken on a special obligation to each and every one of you by taking on the general obligations that come with being your instructor for this class, right? I'm obligated to try and teach each and every one of you, and on the basis of these general obligations that I've taken on, it is right for me to teach you in certain ways and wrong for me to try and teach you in other ways, or, you know, it's right for me to actually teach you and wrong for me to, you know, ignore trying, like, you know, just not put together these lectures and not talk to you and, you know, be a bad teacher. So there are lots of kinds of obligations that it's worth thinking about. So there are general obligations. General obligation is an obligation that you have towards everyone. Particular obligations are had by individuals towards individuals. Natural obligations, these are obligations that, you know, come about because for natural reasons, you know, and so people think generally that, you know, for some, well, you know, something like a natural obligation is formed between parents and children. And special obligations. Special obligations are obligations that individuals take on, right? So when you join a club, you might come to have a special obligation. When you decide to take a job, you have an obligation to, you know, be at the job on time and do the work for the job. Rights and obligations basically usually are related, and so you end up with different kinds of rights and obligations, namely, you know, and here's the sort of obvious ones. Bodily integrity, you have a right to your own bodily integrity, to not being harmed, to not being dismembered. You have a right to life. That means that other people have an obligation to not end your life. You have a right to freedom, which means other people have an obligation not to restrict your freedom of certain sort. You have a right to, you know, probably private property is a right. So that means that other people have an obligation not to steal from you. And then, you know, there's maybe this right that, you know, if life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, well, maybe you have something like the right to pursue happiness. And so people have the obligation to sort of not get in your way and hinder you from pursuing happiness. All right, that brings us to Immanuel Kant. So that was just all kind of the basics of a deontological approach to ethics. Here, now let's get into the nitty-gritty issues of an actual theory. So Kant basically looked at ethics and thought, you know what? I think I can understand what ethics is by understanding the nature of obligations and duties. He thought, if I could figure out what it is to be obligated to someone, what it is to have a duty towards someone, then I could figure out what duties I probably have towards other people. And so Kant thought, well, okay, that means if I can figure out what duties are, I can figure out what duties I have, and then I can figure out what ethics is, because I can figure out, you know, what duties I actually have and what duties other people have towards me. And that really is just the system of ethics, is figuring out what I should do towards people, what I ought to do towards people, and what they ought to do towards me, how they ought to treat me. And there we have it. That would be it. If we could figure out what obligations we have and what duties we have, then we could figure out all of ethics. So Kant basically starts trying to figure out what an obligation is. Like, what is it to have a duty? What is it to be duty bound to someone, to something? What are duties and what are obligations? All right, so here's basically kind of some background to the theory. For Kant, duties are a species of practical requirement. A practical requirement is basically any kind of like rule-based thing that you might think of where it has this kind of structure, right? You have the aim or the goal, and you have the means or the way to reach the goal. And so you can make these statements up, right? In order to blank, one must first blank. So in order to achieve some goal, one must first take the means to that goal, take some action to achieve that goal. So really simple examples, right? So here we've got the ends. The ends are the goals, desires, or the things that are worth doing. And then we've got the means, which are the things that the actions, the intermediary steps, the necessary preconditions. So here's sort of an example. In order to get fit, one must first go to the gym, right? In order to be healthy, one must eat their vegetables, right? These are the kinds of things where the idea is there's, this aim or goal, and then there's the means to achieve it. Those are all practical requirements. They're things that you have to do, requirements on certain practical issues. Like you want stuff that you're gonna do, practice, right? Practical requirements, things that you're gonna do and things that are required of you in order for you to do something. So remember, Kant thinks that duties and obligations are a kind of practical requirement. They work like this. In order to blah, you must first blah. All right. Now, ends are the kinds of thing that Kant thinks of as having authority. Now, what does it mean for an end to have authority? Well, it means that insofar as you accept the end, insofar as you have a goal, then that goal, like the way that you have to achieve that goal is sort of thrust upon you, right? If you actually have a goal, like say your goal is to graduate from college in 4 years, well, then that means that goal has a certain kind of like authority over what it is that you have to do, right? If you have a goal to finish college in 4 years, then you have to take a certain number of units every single quarter or semester in order to graduate, right? That's the kind of, so ends, these things that you're aiming at, have a kind of special like authority over you. They determine what it is that you have to do in order to achieve them. And then the means, of course, again, are the things that the steps you have to take in order to achieve them. All right, now, there's two kinds of practical requirements. There are desire-based practical requirements, and there are institution-based practical requirements. Let me sort of distinguish them. The way that you can sort of know what the difference is between these two is what the goal is, right? So if you take the goal, so say my goal is becoming healthy. Well, why is my goal becoming healthy? Because I want to be healthy. I have a desire to be healthy. Okay, so now that desire creates the goal to be healthy, and then that goal creates all of these things that I have to do, the means to get to that goal. Well, how can I escape that practical requirement of all the things that I have to do in order to get healthy? Well, there is an easy way that I can escape that requirement. I can simply give up the goal and stop desiring to be healthy. Suppose I come to realize that it's too hard, or maybe I have a health issue, and so I just in the end realize that I can't really fully be healthy. Well, then I can give up that desire, and if I give up that desire, then it gets rid of that goal for me, and then that goal then doesn't have any authority over me anymore, right? That goal can't tell me what to do in a certain sense. All right. The other kinds of practical requirements are institution-based. So these are things like this, like you have practical requirements because you are a student, right? You have bought into the institution of college, right? Insofar as you've bought into the institution of college, like you signed a document, you said, yeah, I'm trying to be a student. Well, then the institution gives you certain practical requirements that you have to, follow, right? If you're going to be a student, then you have to send us this much money, then you have to sign up for this many classes, then you have to jump through these hoops and those hoops and these other hoops, right? And that's going to get you on your path towards finishing what you're trying to finish as being a student. How do you escape those practical requirements? Well, you get out from underneath the institution, right? The things that you have to do, like taking certain numbers of classes. If you give up the institution, like, hey, I'm just not going to go to college anymore, then you stop being a student. And then the practical requirements that come with being a student no longer affect you, right? So there's two different ways to escape certain kinds of practical requirements. You can escape some by giving up certain desires, like, hey, I don't want to be healthy anymore, so I'm not going to do all the things that I need to do in order to be healthy. Or you can give up the institution. You can be like, hey, I'm not going to be a student anymore, so I'm not going to be part of the university anymore, and so I no longer have to do all the things that are required in order to be a student. Now, what about morality? What kind of a practical requirement is morality? Is morality a desire-based practical requirement, or is it an institution-based practical requirement? The idea here being like, so do you do what's morally good because you want to do it? Or do you do what's morally good because there's this system that you're kind of subject to, that, the system of human morality, you're part of your culture or something, humanity itself, and there's a system that you're kind of a part of, and that you can, so for Kant, the sort of hallmark of moral requirements is that they're not escapable. Remember, so there's two kinds of practical requirements I talked about, desire-based ones and institution-based ones, and you can distinguish between these two on the basis of how you escape them, right? For desire-based ones, you would give up the desire, and for institution-based ones, you give up, you reject the institution, you try to get yourself out of the institution. But for moral moral requirements being things like, you shouldn't murder people, you shouldn't steal, you shouldn't, mistreat people. Kant wants to say, well, look, these requirements, they don't have escape clauses. It's not like you can say like, well, don't hurt people unless you want to, or something like that, right? There's no unlesses when it comes to morality. True fundamental foundational morality, he thinks, is inescapable. It applies to everyone. The practical requirements apply like to anyone and to everyone, and it doesn't matter who you are. They are universal requirements for everyone to follow. So the idea here is it doesn't matter what your desires are or the institutions that you belong to. Moral requirements always apply. They only cease applying to you when you're dead. Kant thinks that basically moral requirements are unconditional. And that leads him to this distinction between what's called a categorical imperative and a hypothetical imperative. A categorical imperative is a kind of rule that you have to follow categorically, that is one that has no conditions on it. And a hypothetical imperative is a rule that you follow if you meet a certain hypothetical condition. So categorical imperatives, besides the desire-based and the institution-based ones earlier, are a third kind of practical requirement. They apply categorically or unconditionally or always, and they always have authority over you. They have what Kant thinks of as a categorical structure. Here's what a categorical structure looks like, right? Remember earlier, the structure was, if you want to blah, then you have to blah. right? Nope. This one, there's no if clause. There's no part at the beginning that says, if you want to do this first thing, you have to do this other. It's nope, just do blah or don't do blah, right? So the structure of a categorical imperative, here's an example. Do, respect your professors and parents and so on and so on. Don't murder people, steal from people, lie to people, etc. Right? There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. Hypothetical imperatives are like the practical requirements earlier, right? They say things like, if you want to, let's change up the example. If you want to learn to surf, then you must, go out in the ocean. Or if you are if you are a plumber, then let's not do, that's a confusing one. If you are a doctor, then you must pass your boards, which are those tests that you have to take in order to become a doctor. These are hypothetical imperatives. They tell you if a certain condition holds of you, like if you want something or if you are going to try and be something, then you have to do something else, right? These are hypothetical imperatives. That is, they're statements that tell you what you have to do, and they give you a condition on which you can do it. So now we've got three different kinds of practical requirement. Hypothetical requirements involve the desire or the institution-based ones, and categorical requirements, which are unconditional. All right, so now what does it mean to say that a categorical imperative applies unconditionally? That is, okay, so we've got these kinds of categorical practical requirements. A categorical practical requirement is one that is structured like this. It doesn't have an if part. So what does it mean to say that a categorical imperative applies unconditionally? That is, it applies to you and to everyone, and it doesn't matter your situation or what's going on in your life or where you are or how old you are, or it doesn't matter. There is no conditions on it whatsoever. These things just tell you what to do. Well, Kant thinks that categorical imperatives, he says, carry their authority with them. And that's why they don't need an if clause. Hypothetical imperatives begin with a condition that must be met. So they give you this reason, right? A hypothetical condition that you have to meet before you can do what they tell you to do. Otherwise, the hypothetical conditions lack authority over you, right? So take this example. If you want a six-pack, you should put down the pizza, right? If you want to get a six-pack, if you want to work out and get a six-pack, then you can't eat pizza all the time. You're just not going to get the six-pack if you eat pizza all the time. But you can give up the goal of getting a six-pack, right? It's really easy. You just say, I'll stick with the dad bod, right? I'll stick with the dad bod and not worry about whether or not I have a six-pack. And so I can eat as much pizza as I want. Well, here the idea is this rule, if you want a six-pack, put down the pizza, applies to you only if you want a six-pack. Categorical imperatives, on the other hand, apply to you no matter what. They just tell you what to do. They're prescriptive statements. They tell you what to do, they prescribe, and they don't come with the condition that has to be met in order to apply to you, right? Here's some really simple ones, right? Like don't harm or murder anyone, treat people with respect, have a nice day. That's, and that's not really a moral imperative, but that's the kind of imperative that people give you all the time. Categorically, they tell you to have a nice day. They don't say if the weather's nice, have a nice day, or if you're happy and it, have a nice day. So do all imperatives need a condition to apply? That is, are categorical imperatives problematic because they lack conditions under which they apply? Not for Kant. Not for what Kant thinks of as true categorical imperatives. True categorical imperatives are unconditional and inescapable. And, that might seem a little bit strong because, if I tell you always don't lie, you might come up with like a case in which it seems like I should lie, right? There's a case that Kant actually had struggles with, where like imagine a situation in which someone comes to your door with like a gun and they ask you where your brother is, and you know your brother is in the other room, and you know that they're going to, the person at the door is going to like go try and hunt down your brother. And so the question then is like, do you lie to the person, right? If you do lie to the person, then it seems like you're doing something wrong. You know, you have there's this categorical rule that says don't lie. Well, in this case, should you lie, yes or no? You know, is the imperative truly categorical? Should we say don't lie categorically, or should we actually say things like, well, don't lie if you're not in a situation in which someone's life is on the line? Well, Kant thinks that real categorical imperatives really are unconditional and inescapable. But part of why he thinks that is that they're really, really general abstract rules. Kind of like if you think about the abstract rule that we talked about earlier, Mill's greatest happiness principle, that says take the actions that tend to promote the most happiness, right? It's a really abstract rule. Kant's abstract rule is this. He thinks that you should do the things that you have reasons to do. Now, that's a really simple abstract rule, right? He says you should do things that you have reason to do. Well, what does that mean? Like, how does that, what does that tell us that we actually should do? Are there any conditions that you could put on this imperative? Like, if I tell you do the things that you have reasons to do, are there reasons for you to do the things that you have reasons to do? Are there conditions on which I can tell you to do things that you have reasons to do? Here's another example of what Kant really thinks a categorical imperative is. He thinks that the phrase be rational or do what you have the most reason to do is another example of a statement that, applies to you unconditionally. It's something that, there's no ifs, ands, or buts about it, and it applies to you. And ultimately, he thinks that this categorical imperative is the foundation of all of morality. So let's try to think of this through. Basically, what happens, what's going on here, and this is really complicated stuff, so I don't expect you to fully understand it on the first time through, but if you really want to try, you can try and follow me here. Kant thinks that being a rational person, that is someone that acts for certain kinds of reasons and acts on their takes into consideration their best reasons for acting and then acts on them. He thinks that being a rational person and being moral come to the same thing. He thinks ultimately that the phrase be rational and the phrase don't murder have a certain similar inescapable force. They're both imperative statements that tell you what to do that apply to you unconditionally. And he doesn't think that you need a condition. You don't need a reason for either of them to apply to you. It's simply the case that you shouldn't murder, and it's simply the case that you should be rational. Let's try this little experiment. This is a little bit hard to do without a class, but I'll try to do it. Maybe this will work. Why are you in this class right now? Well, probably to learn, right? You're trying to learn about philosophy. Well, I can ask you then, why do you want to learn about philosophy? And you'll probably answer, well, because I need to get a grade in this class and I need to get a good grade on the exam. So I'm in this class to learn about philosophy in order to get a good grade in this class, right? On the papers and, just get a good grade at the end. Well, then I can ask you, well, why would you want to get a good grade? Why would you want to get a good grade on the exam? Well, because you want to get a good grade in the class. And then I ask you, well, why do you want to get a good grade in the class? And you say, well, because I want to get a good GPA. I want to graduate. I want to transfer to a better school. I want to have great grades. And then I ask you, well, why would you want to get a good GPA? Why would you want to graduate? And you might say something like, well, because my parents want me to. And then I could ask, well, why do you care about what your parents think? Or you might think, oh, because I want to get a good job someday. And I might ask, well, why do you want to get a good job? And then you answer, well, probably to make some money or something, maybe to feel like I'm doing something useful, making a difference in the world. And then I ask, okay, well, why do you want to make money or feel like you're making a difference in the world? And then you could respond, well, I guess because those things will make me happy. Money will give me a nice life, and making a difference in the world is something that will make other people happy. And then I can ask you again, well, why do you want to make yourself or other people happy? And then you might stop and not be sure. And you might think, well, because it's good to make other people happy? And then I can ask you, well, why do you want to do what's good? And then you're stuck. Why would you want to do what's good? Is it because it's the right thing to do? Well, then I can ask you, why do you want to do what's the right thing to do? Why should you do what's the right thing to do? Well, now, why should you do what's right? Well, because it's the right thing to do? Well, that's not a reason for doing what's right. What is the reason that you have to do what it's right to do? Well, according to Kant, the reason that you have to that you have to do what's right to do is just that's how reason and rationality works. That's the structure of doing things. You have reasons to do the things, to do the right things, because that's just how rationality is. Why should you act for the right reasons? Is it because they're right? Of course. But broader question, why should you act for any reasons at all? Why not just act in the world, wave your arms around, do whatever, don't act for any reasons? Why not just kind of flail around in the world? Well, that wouldn't really be acting. That's not how it works. When you do stuff in the world, you have to act for reasons. And then you can act for reasons that are right or wrong. And right reasons are the reasons that you take to help you actually achieve the kinds of actions that you're trying to take. So if you ask the question, why should I act for any reason whatsoever? It makes you look like you don't understand what it is to act in the first place. Because to act in the first place is to do something because you have a reason to do it. And so ultimately, to say, why should you act for any reason at all, is to say that if I were to give you a reason why you should act for reasons, then you would have to follow that reason. You would have to accept that that is a good reason for acting for reasons. Now, that was a big, complicated mess, and I don't expect you to follow it. If you want, you can go back and watch it again. But the point of this experiment is to try and show you this. It's to show you that there are some imperatives, some statements that tell you what to do, that don't offer you further reasons to act on. Do whatever you have the most reason to do is not something that you can question with, well, why should I? Why should I do that? If I tell you, do whatever you have the most reason to do, and you ask me, why should I? You've basically given up this game that I was playing earlier, right? Why do you want to do that? Why should you do that? Why should you do that? It gives up the game because what it says is, I should give you a reason to do whatever you have the most reason to do. But that doesn't even make sense. That just doing what you have the most reason to do is just how acting works. If someone tells you to act on the reasons that you have, and you say, why should I act on the reasons that I have? You're asking for someone to give you a reason to act for reasons. Hopefully now you see then that in asking why should I act for reasons, you admit in a certain sense that reasons themselves have a kind of authority over you. In asking the question, you ask for you ask basically for a reason. Here's a similar puzzle to make the kind of the same point, and I mean this might be a little bit easier for people to grasp, because this is really a confusing point to be trying to make. So suppose you believe in divine command theory. That is, suppose you think that the reason you should do some action is because God commanded it. Question though, who tells us that we should do what God says we should do? That is, if you're a divine command theorist and you think the reason that, murder is wrong is because God tells us not to murder, what reason do you have to listen to what God says? Well, it can't be that God tells us to listen to God and that that's the reason that we have for listening to what God tells us what to do, right? God's authority here is in question. So I'm asking why I should listen to what God tells us what to do in the first place. That is, what reason is there for doing what God commands? The issue here is that divine command theory rests on a hypothetical imperative. It says that if you're subject to God's authority, then you should do what God tells you to do. But you can always ask, well, why? Why am I subject to God's authority? Why should I do what God wants, what God tells me to do? And sometimes you can escape this authority. Categorical imperatives, however, are unconditional and escapable. They have their own kind of internal or intrinsic authority. They're the kinds of things that Kant thinks it makes no sense to ask, well, why should I do that? They're just the things that are to be done. They don't have reasons for them. They don't need reasons for them. They just are unconditional and inescapable rules of action. All right. That finally brings us to what Kant thinks the categorical imperative is. And if you've made it this far, good on you. I'll wrap this up with these two discussions of the categorical imperative. So according to Kant, the categorical imperative, like the rule that we ought to follow in morality, has lots of different formulations. There's lots of different ways he thinks of saying the same thing. But he says it in very different ways, and people get really confused by these. If you are confused by this first one, I suggest you watch one of the other videos that I posted below, the one on Kant and deontological ethics. The guy on I forget the philosophy YouTube channel name, but the guy explains it pretty well. This formula is called the formula of universal law. And basically it says this: act only on the maxim that you can at the same time will to be a universal law. And what that basically says is that what you should do is you should follow the rules that you can at the same time think everybody should follow. You should follow rules of action. You should do things that rules of action, you should do things in accordance with rules that you think you could follow, where you think everybody in the whole world at the same time could follow those same rules. That's basically Kant's categorical imperative. And that's a really basic, very general claim. It basically says, do things that you have reasons to do, and you think that everybody else could have the sort of same reasons to do them, and it wouldn't, be an issue if everybody else did that thing for that same reason. A more intuitive formulation, and one that I'm going to talk about for a second longer, is what we call the formula of humanity. And the formula of humanity is actually, I think, the plausible formula when it comes to thinking about Kantian ethics. The formula of humanity says this: act so as to treat humanity, wherever you see it, in yourself and in others, always as an end and never merely as a means. Now, what the heck does that mean? Basically, Kant sees humanity, or like rationality. He sees the ability to make rational decisions, to think, and to have a personal choice in the matter. He sees that as inherently valuable, intrinsically valuable, as a matter of fact. And so he thinks that if you see people, if you see humanity, if you see individuals that can make decisions for themselves, you always should treat those individuals as ends in themselves, as things that should be promoted, as things that are worth promoting, as things that are valuable and worth treating as valuable. And never treat them merely as a means. That is, never treat them only as a way to get what you want. So if you see people, if you come across something that has humanity, something that has the ability to make decisions, to think, to set life goals, to plan, to try and do things, you should never treat that thing as a mere means to your own gain, to your own goals. You should always take into consideration that thing's goals as well, and treat that thing as something that should be helped along. Here's a case study. Here's sort of an example here. Slavery. If you enslave someone, you treat them as a mere means to your own ends. That is, you treat them in a way where you disregard their ends for your own ends. You enslave them to your own goals or desires. If you have something that you want to do and you have someone that is enslaved to you, then you can tell them to disregard their own ends, their things that they want, the things that they want to pursue, their own goals, and pursue yours. Their ends become your ends instead of their own. On Kant's view, this is unacceptable. On Kant's view, we ought never treat anyone that is, a human as if they don't have any of their own ends. We ought never treat people in ways that disregard what they want completely, right? We ought never treat people in ways where we will sort of use and abuse them for our own gain without taking into consideration their gain as well. A sort of basic idea here. So like what it is to use someone as a means, like, your boss, if you have a job, uses you as a means, right? You do work for your boss, but your boss doesn't treat you as a mere means because your boss pays you for your job, right? Your boss gives you compensation for the work provided, and that compensation can then go towards your plans, right? Your ends. You can then use that money that you get from your job to do with it as you will. That is why, that's what it means to be used as a means, but not as a mere means. And so Kant is saying, like, it's, we all do use one another as a means to our own ends. But what you can't do, what you're restricted from doing on Kant's view in the categorical imperative, is treating people as merely a means to an end. A final way of thinking about the categorical imperative that I think is it's maybe helpful, is that Kant thinks that there's this ultimate moral rule, kind of like the golden rule almost. The golden rule says treat people as you want them to treat you, but it's sort of like that, but it's a little bit different. It's treat things that are valuable in such a way that you respect their value. That is something like treat a valuable thing with the respect that it deserves because it has the value that it has, right? He thinks basically if something is able to set up its own goals and take its own actions to meet its own goals, then it's got to be a thing that has value, right? Human rationality, human beings are valuable in and of themselves. And so, insofar as a human being is valuable in and of itself, you ought to treat it as valuable, and you ought to treat it with the respect for the value that it has. So, on the Kantian view, once we see that things have value, we ought to treat those things with the respect that that value demands. And if we don't, then we mistreat that thing. And that's to do morally wrong. Ultimately, that's Kant's kind of view. And that's why on the Kantian view, something like the simple case of slavery, why it's morally wrong to own slaves, because to own slaves is to mistreat the value of something. It's to not treat the thing that has value, a human person, as valuable as it is. It's to disregard this thing that has its own goals and desires and means for creating its own well-being, and to treat it as if it's merely a tool to your own goals and your own desires. And basically we can then take that analogy and apply it to everything. So Kant thinks like, when you lie to someone, what you're doing is you're using them as a mere means. You're using them as a tool to get what you want. And you're not treating the fact that they, can take, that they can handle the truth, right? That they can take the truth and then they can decide for themselves what's the best thing to do, what's right and what's wrong, right? Kant thinks, like obviously like murdering someone is wrong because you're treating someone, people have a right to life and people don't want their lives to be ended. And if you're murdering someone, you're treating their life as something that doesn't matter, and your desire for them to be dead is something that matters somehow more than their life, which is to mistreat them because it doesn't respect their desire for their own life, which is something that is ultimately valuable. All right, so I think I'll leave it there, and hopefully that wasn't too confusing to everyone. If it was, I would love to get some comments and some feedback. Kant is one of the most difficult philosophers to teach, especially in ethics, but he's well worth it. He's really interesting, and I highly hope that if any of you continue learning about philosophy, you'll take some classes where you study Kant more closely. All right. I should be able to post the quiz by the end of the week, and that will be it for this week. Let's see. There's a little bit. I do want to do a little bit on a view that's called virtue ethics, and I'll probably post that lecture later, maybe later this week, but it'll be for sort of next week, and I think we'll just be pushing things off a little bit. All right. Hope you have a good rest of your week.